Rome's invisible balance sheet. It was never published, never audited, and never debated in Parliament, yet it shaped markets more powerfully than any official budget. In Rome, the most important balance sheet was the one no one could see. To understand why this invisible ledger mattered, we need to look beyond formal debt and into expectation. Italy's public finances have long been measured, scrutinized, and negotiated. Numbers were known, risks were priced, and yet something else influenced confidence just as strongly: assumptions about what the state would ultimately absorb. The story begins with obligations that did not appear on official accounts, guarantees implied rather than declared, support expected rather than promised, commitments that existed politically, socially, and economically, but not legally. Markets understood them instinctively. They priced Italy not just on what it owed, but on what it might one day be forced to carry. Inside Rome, this shadow balance sheet shaped policy choices quietly. Decisions were weighed not only against deficit targets, but against how much unseen obligation could be stretched without being tested. Certain risks were tolerated because they were assumed manageable in extremis. Stability relied on belief as much as accounting. Banks, utilities, regions, and strategic firms all live within this unspoken framework. Their strength mattered, but so did their proximity to the state. When pressure built, markets asked a simple question: would Rome allow this to fail? The answer was never stated, but it was often assumed. That assumption lowered costs and delayed reckoning. It allowed the system to function smoothly during calm periods, but it also concentrated risk where transparency was weakest. The invisible balance sheet grew not through new promises, but through accumulation of expectation. What made this dangerous was ambiguity. Official numbers could be managed, expectations could not. They expanded silently, shaped by history, politics, and memory. And when markets price belief instead of structure, adjustment becomes sudden once belief is questioned. Rome's invisible balance sheet did not appear overnight. It formed gradually, reinforced by every crisis avoided and every rescue implied. By the time anyone tried to measure it, it was already embedded in confidence. The danger was not that it existed. It was that no one knew its true size until the moment someone asked whether it could still be honored. The invisible balance sheet expanded because it rarely needed to be tested. Each episode of stress ended with stability restored. No explicit bailout was required. No formal guarantee was triggered. Yet the belief that Rome would intervene if necessary grew stronger with every near miss. Inside financial institutions, this belief influenced behavior subtly. Risk was still managed, but tail scenarios were softened by expectation of state absorption. Funding costs reflected not just fundamentals, but proximity to implied support. The market priced Italy's system as interconnected, not isolated. Policy decisions absorbed the same logic. Reform was negotiated with an eye toward confidence rather than exposure. Hard choices were deferred when markets remained calm. The absence of crisis validated patience. The invisible ledger remained unused and therefore unquestioned. External investors played a role as well. They differentiated Italian risk not only by debt levels, but by political reality. Certain obligations were considered untouchable. Others were assumed negotiable. That differentiation never appeared in budgets, but it guided capital flows. Regulators watched the pattern with concern. Implicit commitments are powerful, but they weaken discipline when left undefined. Yet confronting them publicly risked destabilizing the very confidence they supported. Silence remained preferable to clarification. What made the situation fragile was accumulation. Expectations layered upon expectations. Each implied backstop reinforced the next. The system functioned, but its margin for surprise narrowed. If multiple obligations demanded support at once, Rome's choices would become visible. The invisible balance sheet did not represent hidden debt alone. It represented hidden responsibility. Markets believed the state stood behind more than it had acknowledged. That belief stabilized behavior until it threatened to overwhelm capacity. Italy's calm did not mean its obligations were small. It meant they were deferred, and deferral, while comforting, carries a cost when timing turns against it. The question was no longer whether Rome could manage its visible debt. It was whether it could meet expectations that had never been formally counted. The tension surfaced when pressure began arriving from multiple directions at once. Growth slowed. Financing conditions tightened. Local stresses that once appeared manageable in isolation started overlapping. None of them were catastrophic. Together, they forced markets to reconsider how much the state could realistically absorb. Funding costs reacted unevenly. Some entities retained confidence. Others faced sharper scrutiny. The divergence exposed how much pricing had depended on assumption rather than structure. Investors were no longer asking whether Rome would step in. They were asking how far it could go. Inside government, the invisible balance sheet became a practical concern. Choices that once felt theoretical demanded prioritization. Which obligations were essential, which could be renegotiated, which assumptions might have to be corrected publicly. The absence of clarity became a liability. Banks adjusted behavior quickly. Liquidity buffers grew. Exposure to implied support was reduced where possible. Institutions prepared for a world where proximity no longer guaranteed protection. The shift was cautious but widespread. Regulators faced a difficult trade-off. Reinforcing expectations risked enlarging the invisible ledger further. Challenging them risked destabilizing confidence abruptly. The path forward required narrowing belief without breaking trust. Signals were sent carefully. Language emphasized resolution rather than rescue. Stress tests highlighted independence rather than support. The message was subtle but intentional. Not everything could be carried by the state. Markets absorbed the shift with discomfort rather than panic. Pricing adjusted. Risk premiums reappeared. Confidence thinned, but it did not collapse. The invisible balance sheet was being reduced, not through repayment, but through recalibration of belief. What Italy confronted was not insolvency. It was expectation management. The state was solvent, but not limitless. The difference mattered once assumptions became explicit. The invisible balance sheet had stabilized Italy for years. But once its boundaries were tested, it had to be reshaped, or it would shape outcomes itself. The adjustment unfolded gradually by design. Rome did not announce a retreat from responsibility. It clarified it. Support became conditional. Boundaries were emphasized. Markets were invited to price reality rather than reassurance. Institutions adapted accordingly. Risk became differentiated again. Proximity to the state no longer guaranteed uniform treatment. Balance sheets strengthened where reliance had been assumed. The system absorbed the change without a sudden break, but not without friction. Italy's invisible balance sheet did not vanish. It became smaller, clearer, and more manageable. Expectations that could not be honored were quietly dissolved. Those that remained were reinforced through transparency rather than silence. The lesson was not that implicit support is dangerous. It is that it must evolve. When left undefined, it grows unchecked. When clarified, it can stabilize without distorting discipline. Rome learned that confidence built on ambiguity eventually demands clarification. Doing so early preserves trust. Doing so late forces correction. Italy chose a slower, steadier path. The invisible balance sheet no longer defines Italy's risk. It informs it. Markets now see not just what Rome owes, but what it is willing and able to carry. Sometimes stability requires making the unseen visible before uncertainty does it for you. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? Rome